Sponsored by Rabbi Shlomi and Mirla Greenwald. This is a Sicha from Likutei Sichos, Chelek Gimmel, Parshas Korach, Sicha, Beis, and the topic of the Sicha is that in this week's Parsha we learn about the mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash. And there are 4 parts in the Sicha. It's actually a very long Sicha, which is breaking it down into 4 general parts. The Rebbe will, number 1, present what the Rambam says about this mitzvah, both in Sefer HaMitzvahs and in Sefer HaYad. Number 2, ask 4 questions. Number 3, present how the beginning of Maseches Tamid and Maseches Midas start with this mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash. And number 4, explain these teachings of Maseches Tamid and Maseches Midas, and then come back to answer the original questions. From the psukim in our parsha, and these are psukim starting in Perek Yud Ches, Pasuk Aleph, but really the topic starts beforehand in the previous parak at the very end, where it says, "Vayemer b'nei Yisrael al Moshe lemar hein gavanu avadnu kolonu avodnu kol hakariv hakariv el Mishkan Hashem yamos ha'im tamnu ligvaya," where the Yidden complained that they would die if they went to the Mikdash when they weren't allowed to. And in response to that, so Vayemer Hashem al Aaron, Ato uvenecho ubeis avicha itach, so tisus avein Mikdash. It's going to be upon you, this sin of people entering the Mikdash. And it goes on to say how their job is going to be to guard the Mikdash so that nobody enters. So from the psukim in our parsha that talk about guarding the Mikdash, so the Rambam learned in Sefer HaMitzvahs, shetzivanu lishmar HaMikdash, that Hashem commanded us to guard the Mikdash, v'lalechas svivei tamid, and to constantly walk around it, l'chabdei, u'lereimimei, u'legadlei, to honor it, and to uplift it, and to make it great. V'u amri la'arin, and this is where Hashem says to Aaron, at the start of Perek Ches, va'ato u'venecha itach lifnei oyel eidus, that you and your sons with you should be before the oyel eidus. Right? So Lemar, what he means to say is, atem tiyuli lefanei tamid, you should be for me, you should be before me constantly. Ukvar nichbal ze'at sive v'loshen acher, and this command was also repeated in different words, and this is in Pasuk Dalet over there, V'hu Amrei, and this is where Hashem says, V'shamru es mishmeres oil mayed v'chulu. They should guard the guarding of the oil mayed, etc. So over here we have the mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash, the way the Rambam describes it in Sefer HaMitzvahs. Now in Sefer HaYad, in Hilchas Beis B'chira, the Rambam explains the mitzvah saseh of guarding the Mikdash, and he says, Shmirus HaMikdash mitzvah saseh, guarding the Mikdash is a mitzvah saseh, and even though there's no fear of enemies or thieves, still it's necessary, because the guarding is only for the purpose of honoring it. You can't compare a palace that has guards to a palace that doesn't have guards. And he continues in the next halacha, and this guarding is all night long. And the shemim, the guards, are the kehanim and the levim. Shenemar, like it says in the pasuk, that you and your sons together with you should be before the oyel eidus. Kalemer, what it means to say is atem tiyu shemim loy, that you should be guards for it. Vari nemar v'shamru es mishmeres oyel moed, and it also says, and they should guard the guarding of the oyel moed. V'nemar, and furthermore it says v'achreinim kedma lefnei oyel moed, those who camped to the east before the oyel moed, mizracha, to the east, were Moshe v'Aaron uvanav, Moshe, Aaron, and his sons, shemrei mishmeres hakedesh, those who guard the guarding of what was holy. And there are 4 questions here. Now the text already went away because it was very long, but we'll go through the 4 questions. The first question is, in Sefer HaYad, the Rambam brings the psukim at the end, and he brings them as a proof that the guards are the kehanim and the levim. Whereas in Sefer HaMitzvahs, he brings the psukim as a source for the very mitzvah itself of guarding the Mikdash. So the question is, why is this that in Sefer HaYad, the Rambam doesn't bring the psukim as a source for the actual mitzvah itself, and he only brings it as a source that the guards are the kehanim and the levim? The second question is, if the mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash isn't because of fear of enemies and thieves, as the Rambam writes in Sefer HaYad, then it should have to apply the whole day and the whole night. And so the question is that the Rambam writes in Sefer Hayad, Ushmira zu mitzvasa kol halayla, that this guarding, its mitzvah, is the entire night and not during the day. The third question is, and this is a build-up from the second question, in the psukim that speak about guarding the Mikdash, there's no indication that the guarding is only at night. And simply, when we read these psukim, they imply that the guarding should be at all times. And like the Rambam indeed writes in Sefer HaMitzvahs, that Atem tiyu li lefonai tamid, you should be for me, before me, tamid, constantly. And the fourth question is, the Rambam writes in Sefer HaMitzvahs, he says over there that Shetzivanu lishmar Mikdash, that Hashem commanded us to guard the Mikdash, v'lolechas svivay tamid, and to go around it constantly. And the question is, what's the idea of this walking around the Mikdash constantly, and how is it related to the mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash, where the guarding occurred in specific places? So all of this will be understood by first explaining the sheer beginning of Maseches Tamid and Maseches Midas. Both Maseches Tamid and Maseches Midas begin with the same teaching. At the very beginning, they both start and say, B'shloisha Mekaymis, in three places, HaKayanim Shemrim Bebeis HaMikdash. The Kayanim would guard in the Beis HaMikdash. And the question is, one of them seems to be extra, and especially since Maseches Midas comes immediately after Maseches Tamid. Now we're going to move on to support the question by negating an answer that's given for it. So this answer is given by the Hamefarish to Maseches Tamid, and he explains over there, the question is really just on Maseches Tamid. The question is not on Maseches Midas, because the place of this teaching is in Maseches Midas. Like we see the second teaching in Maseches Midas, right after it says, B'shloisha Mekaymis HaKayanim Shemrim Bebeis HaMikdash, it says that the Levium guarded in 21 places. So the question is really, why is it taught in Maseches Tamid? So in the Mefarish to Maseches Tamid, he explains that since the Tana in Maseches Tamid wants to teach about the Maisa Tamid, which was done by the Kehanim, so therefore the Tana starts by teaching where the Kehanim guarded during the night and where they slept, and then he goes through all the details of the Tamid, which started at the beginning of the day. So the Tana is just organizing the information based on what occurred during the night, and then he leads straight into how it went into the Maisa Tamid itself. However, the Rebbe points out that since this Mishnah ends up being taught in Maseches Tamid, so why does it have to be taught again in Maseches Midas? And it should have began, Maseches Midas should have began by teaching just the places where the Levium guarded, because we already know about the Kehanim. It should have started right off at the beginning, not with B'shloisha Mekaymis HaKayanim Shemrim Bebeis HaMikdash, but rather with the next teaching, which is Be'esrim Ve'echad Mekaymis HaLevium Shemrim Bebeis HaMikdash, that the Levium guarded in the Beis HaMikdash in 21 places. Even though we can say that since the Tana needs to teach us in Maseches Midas about the guarding of the Levium, so the Tana teaches the whole din of guarding, including of the Kehanim. So even though we could answer that, but still, there is a bit of a difficulty in saying that since it was already taught in Maseches Tamid. So we can say that the explanation in all of this is the mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash can be explained in two ways. One way is that it's a detail in the matters of the Beis HaMikdash. Another way is that it's a detail in the avodah of the Kehanim and the Levium. In another signon, another way of presenting and explaining this, that we could either say that the mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash is relevant to the Mikdash itself. It's a choivas cheftza, that the Mikdash has to be guarded, and it's just that the chiyuv is placed on the Kehanim and the Levium. In other words, the Beis HaMikdash has to be guarded, and that's what matters over here. It's relevant and related to the Beis HaMikdash, and it's just that the chiyuv is placed on the Kehanim and the Levium. Or another way of looking at it is that the mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash from the very start is a chayvas gavra. It's something the Kehanim and the Levium need to do. It's not about the Mikdash. It's something that's placed on the gavra himself, and that's where it begins and ends. And it's from the mitzvahs of the Kehanim and the Levium. And it's just that the chiyuv is to guard the Mikdash, but it's not related to the cheftza, the item of the Mikdash itself. It's a mitzvah on the Kehanim and the Levim, and like we'll see, that we're going to say in the next section as we continue with the answer, that the purpose would be to stop people from entering where they're not allowed to enter. So it's not related to the Mikdash, but rather it's related to a chayva, an obligation that's placed on the Kehanim and the Levim. And to continue with this explanation, so we can say that it depends, how we look at it depends on the reason for the guarding. If the reason for the guarding is because of kavod, in order to honor the Beis Hamikdash, and like the Rambam writes, Eina deima palterin sheyesh olav shemrin, the palterin she'ein olav shemrin. Like the Rambam indeed writes, that it's about the honor of the Beis Hamikdash. So then it's a detail in the palterin. It's about the Beis Hamikdash being guarded, and it's just that the chiyuv is placed on the Kehanim the Levim. However, if it's an order that a Zar or Tamri doesn't enter, or it's in order to guard the Kalim, then it's a detail in the Chiyuvim of the Kehanim and the Levim. The Kehanim and Levim have certain responsibilities. It's associated with things that they do with the Beis Hamikdash, but it's not related to the Cheftza, the item of the Beis Hamikdash, needing this. And according to this, we can explain why the Mishneh of Bishloishim Mekayim Sakainim Shemim Beis Hamikdash is taught in the beginning of Maseches Tamid and the beginning of Maseches Midas. Maseches Midas, as its name indicates, is all about Midas HaMikdash v'tzirasoi u'binyanoi v'chol inyanov. It's all about the item of the Beis Hamikdash. And so it teaches over there about this din, because that's the aspect that's relevant to the chefs of the Beis Hamikdash. And Maseches Tamid is about the avodas done in the Beis Hamikdash. Like it says, that it tells us, the Rambam writes, how did they bring the Tamid? And in both Masechtas, the Mishnah teaches us, because in the mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash, there are indeed two aspects. It's not one or the other. There's two aspects. The aspect of the Aveda of the Kehanim, which is Masechtas Tamid, tells us about the Avedas that were done in the Beis Hamikdash, and included in that would be the Aveda of guarding it that was done by the Kehanim. And there is the aspect of the Mikdash itself, which is what Maseches Midas talks about, and that's why it's a Maseches Midas as well. And now we could come back to our first question, where we asked how come the Rambam doesn't bring the Psukim in Sefer Hayad as the source for the mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash. So according to this, it's understood why the Rambam didn't bring in Hilchos Beis HaBchira the Psukim as a proof for the din of guarding the Mikdash. And we're going to continue in the next section. It's just that there's not enough room here, so we're going to separate it into two audios. But according to what we said, it'll be understood. And the explanation is, according to the Rambam, the mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash is a detail in the Mikdash itself. And like the Rambam writes, Ein shmirasai ella kavod loi. The shmir is only for the honor of it, of the Mikdash. Because ein adema palterin sheyesh olav shemrin, the palterin she'ein olav shemrin. Because you can't compare a palace that has guards to a palace that doesn't have guards. And like it's also proven from the fact that the Rambam brought the dinim of guarding the Mikdash in Hilchos Beis HaBchira, which talks about the Kedushas or Mitzvahs Beis HaBchira itself, and not the Avedas that were done in it. And that's why the Rambam didn't bring these psukim, because in these psukim it only talks about the chiyuv of the gavra. And more importantly, these psukim come as a continuation to the claim and the concern of the Yidden that kol ha'karev ha'karev el mishkan Hashem yamos, that they were concerned that whoever comes there will die, and therefore Hashem commanded Ato v'necha u'beis avicha itach tisu asavayin ha'mikdash v'ato v'necha itach lifnei oyel mayid, where it was said in response to the Yidden's concern that they would be harmed, they would die if they went where they were not allowed to in the Mikdash, in the Mishkan. And so that's not related to the Mikdash itself, but rather to the Gavra. And that's why the Rambam doesn't bring these psukim. And the Rebbe in the Aris talks about why the Rambam does bring the psukim in the Sefer Mitzvahs, even though over there as well, he holds that it's only related to the item of the Mikdash itself, because the Rambam is not getting into the details of the psukim. He's just bringing the general source that the psukim teach about the guarding, but the specifics is not what he's getting into. Whereas in Sefer Hayad, the Rambam is more particular and more exact about the sources that he brings. And so therefore those sources, those psukim, won't fit with the opinion of the Rambam that the Shmira is for the Mikdash itself, it's for the Chefts of the Mikdash, and it's not something that's placed on the Gavra. Coming back to this explanation that there's two aspects to the Shmira, so there are three questions over here. So that is in addition to the fact that there are still three remaining questions from the beginning of the Sicha, the two questions about guarding the Mikdash at night, and the question about what's the walking around the Mikdash, and how does it connect to the mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash. So besides for that, there are three questions here. The first question is, if guarding the Mikdash is because of kavod, then even one or a few guards are enough. Because once you have one guard or a few guards, you already gave kavod to the Mikdash. And so, according to that, why is the teaching of Be'esrim ve'echad mekaymes, halavim, shemim, beveis HaMikdash, taught in Maseches Midas? Once the Mishnah teaches us that b'shloisha mekaymes, hakayanim, shemim, beveis HaMikdash, so already have the idea of giving kavod to the chefts of the Mikdash, and there's no need to teach about Be'esrim ve'echad mekaymes, halavim, shemim, beveis HaMikdash in Maseches Midas. It should be taught elsewhere Mishnayos. But for Maseches Midas, it's unnecessary, because once we already have the kavod that's being given to the Mikdash through one person or a group of people, it's already accomplished, and having more groups or additional people is unnecessary. So we have to teach one thing. So once the first teaching is taught, B'shloisha mekaymes hakaynim shemim beveis Mikdash, so the Mishnah should stop with that. It already taught something related to the Mikdash in Maseches Midas, and then move on to the next teaching that's relevant. And the teaching of Be'esrim ve'echad mekaymes, halavim shem beveis Mikdash, will be taught elsewhere in Mishnayos. The second question is, so the first question was about why the Shmira of the Levim is taught in Maseches Midas. The second question is, on the other hand, how is the Shmira of the Mikdash related to Maseches Tamid, which talks about the Tamid? The whole idea of Maseches Tamid is to explain the Avodas of the Tamid, and like the name of the Masechta, Maseches Tamid. And like the Rambam himself writes, Maseches Tamid ein ba dibur, lo al dvar chochma, v'lo al dvar iser v'heter, elo sipur, shu eimer each hoyu makriv ma Tamid, kedei lases kein Tamid. It just describes how the Tamid is brought. That's the teachings, that's what the content of Maseches Tamid is. And so the question is, why is the halacha about the guarding, the shmira of the Kehanim taught in Maseches Tamid? The Avedas of the Kehanim belongs in the Maseches that talk about the Avedas of the Kehanim, like Yuma, Zvachim, and Menachos, but not in Maseches Tamid that talks mainly about the Korban Tamid. And the third question is, and this is in a way the biggest of all the questions, is we need more understanding of the explanation that guarding the Mikdash is a detail in the Mikdash itself. That explanation is still lacking, because even according to this explanation, that the guarding is only for the kavod of the Mikdash, but still there's a question over here, and that is, why is it therefore taught in Masechtas Midas, which is about the measurements and the building of the Mikdash itself, and not the Avodah is done in it? Yes, this Avodah is done for the Mikdash, but there's still two things here. There's the Mikdash, and there's an Avodah being done, and the Avodah is being done for the kavod of the Mikdash, but it's still separate from the Mikdash itself. And Maseches Midas is not about Avodah being done in the Mikdash, even if the Avodah is for the kavod of the Mikdash. Maseches Midas is about the measurements and the building of the Mikdash itself. And this still remains something outside of the Mikdash. And so why is the whole teaching about the guarding of the Mikdash, both of the Kehanim and the Levim, being taught in Maseches Midas? So in order to answer these questions, we need to go into a side discussion, which is directly related to our current discussion. So this will be understood by first explaining what some answer regarding our second question at the beginning of the Sicha, which was that if the guarding is because of kavod, like it says in the Rambam, then why didn't they also guard it during the day? And they explain, as an answer to this question, that through the walking of the Kehanim ana va'ana during the day in their Avodah, so that itself is kulei kavod. That's all kavod for the Mikdash. But at night, when there is no avodah, we must show kavod to the mikdash through guarding. So it comes out that the guarding is for the kavod. It's just that during the day, the kavod's already there because the kehanim are working in the Beis Mikdash, and that's kulei kavod. It's just that at night there is no avodah, and therefore it requires the guarding in order to give the mikdash the kavod. And the question is, what's exactly this kavod that comes about through the avodah of the kehanim, and also how is this kavod similar to the kavod that's achieved through guarding? So what exactly is the definition of this kavod that we have through the avodah of the kehanim, and how is it similar to the kavod that is achieved through guarding, that we could say that during the day it's already there? And because of this question, the Rebbe explains that the idea of the guarding for kavod is that they shouldn't have hesach hadas from the mikdash. And like the Rosh indeed writes, what is kavod HaMikdash? That's the idea of kavod HaMikdash, that the guarding achieves, that they're not masiach das from the mikdash. And according to this, we could understand what the kavod is in our question. What's this kavod that comes about through the avodah of the kehanim, and how is this kavod similar to guarding? Because both of them are that they're not masiach das from the mikdash, and that's the kavod of the mikdash. And this isn't like the hesach hadas by kachim, which is out of a concern of tumah, but rather it's the hepech hesach hadas that shows the greatness of the mikdash, that there are always people around it, and they don't take their minds off of it. And this is similar to the hesach hadas that we talk about, that's not allowed to be had by tefillin and the tzitz, that it has to do with not taking your mind off of it because of its chashivas. And so there we see the similarity between the avodah of the kehanim and the guarding, because both of them reflect this idea that they shouldn't take their mind off of the mikdash. According to this explanation, that the shmiras mikdash is that there shouldn't be any hesach hadas. So we're now going to answer all of our earlier questions, and we're going to start with answering the most recent question, which was how come the teaching of b'shloishim hakayim shemim Beis Mikdash is taught both at the beginning of Maseches Tamid and at the beginning of Maseches Midas, and then afterwards we're going to move on to answer all the other questions. Now, even this part of the answer itself, it's going to be broken down into 3 parts. Also, there's one more thing that's important to mention, and that is, now that we introduce this idea, as we can see, it's a new answer that comes out from the question, because we're no longer going to go along with the previous construct, the previous idea that there's 2 parts of Shmiras HaMikdash, which is the Chefza and the Gavra, but rather we're going to go with just saying that there's one aspect of Shmiras HaMikdash, which is that they shouldn't be Masiach Das, and we're going to see how with that we're going to explain how it fits both in Maseches Tamid and Maseches Midas. We don't need 2 explanations, one from Maseches Tamid and one from Maseches Midas, but rather we can use this one explanation and show how based on it, it's understood why it's taught in both Maseches Tamid and in Maseches Midas. So this type of guarding, which is that they shouldn't have hesach hadas from the Mikdash, is a matter that's related to the Mikdash itself. This is something about the Mikdash itself. It adds to the very greatness of the Mikdash. It's not that there's a Mikdash and it has to be given kavod, but rather the Mikdash itself gets elevated to a higher level because of not being Masiach Das from it, which shows about the prominence of the Mikdash. So it's much more connected to the Mikdash, and therefore it's taught in Maseches Midas, meaning that this is not an Aveda whose place is in the Beis HaMikdash, but rather it's about the importance of the Mikdash itself. And like the words of the Rambam, that Eina Demer Palterin Sheyesh Alav Shemin, the Palterin She'ein Alav Shemim. That it's not a separate thing which is done in the place of the Mikdash, but rather with this guarding, it changes the Palterin itself. And so what changed over here from the first explanation that we gave about kavod and this explanation of Shalei Sichu Das, it's not articulated explicitly, clearly in the Sicha, but it seems that what changed is that by the kavod, even though it's a kavod to the Beis HaMikdash, there's the Beis HaMikdash and there's the kavod that people give to the Beis HaMikdash. Whereas over here, when we're talking about not to be Masiach Das, not being Masiach Das adds to the very greatness of the Mikdash itself. It's not kavod that's being given to it, but rather it's not taking one's mind away from it, which then elevates and adds greatness to the Mikdash itself. And therefore it's much more associated and connected to the very being of the Mikdash. And that's why it's taught in Maseches Midas, which talks about the structure and the measurements of the actual Mikdash. And then the Rebbe connects this, I'm not going to get into it, to the Maimar Razal, that Kol Mishalei Nivna Beis HaMikdash B'Yamav, Harei Kilu Nechrav B'Yamav, that according to this explanation, then the Beis HaMikdash that's Nechrav B'Yamav is a Beis HaMikdash which is on a much higher level, that you can't even be Mesiach Das from it, which elevates the very Beis HaMikdash itself. And so it comes out that what's Nechrav B'Yamav is a Beis HaMikdash that's that much greater. According to this, we can understand why the Rambam writes, Ushmir Zu Mitzvasa Kalalayla, which was our second question in the Sicha, in the earlier part of the presentation. Why does the Rambam say it's only a night? And also we asked that it doesn't seem that the Pasuk is saying that. So we're going to answer both of those questions here. And also we can understand why this teaching of the Kehanim guarding in the Beis HaMikdash is taught in Maseches Tamid. Because in the day, the Kehanim were working in the Beis HaMikdash, starting with the Tamid. From when Heir Pnei HaMizrach, from the time of Heir Pnei HaMizrach, they started working on the Tamid. And when Karbanos were brought, the Kehanim needed to have Kavanah, the 6 things they had to have in mind. And it's obvious that when the Kehanim are doing their Avodah, that is the opposite of Hesach Hadas. So whatever is accomplished through guarding the Mikdash, which is that they shouldn't be Masiach Das, is already there and in place through the Avodah. However, at night, when there was no Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash, they were commanded to guard the Mikdash in order not to have any Hesach Hadas. So that's the explanation for why the Shmira is only at night. And we say this even though that's not what's implied in the Pasuk, because the goal of the Shmira is that they shouldn't have any Hesach Hadas from the Mikdash. And that's already accomplished through the Avodah in the Mikdash during the day. And so it's only the only time that it's required to have the Shmira in order that there shouldn't be any Hesach Hadas is at night. And this is the connection of the mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash to Maseches Tamid, that it is as a result, therefore taught right at the beginning, because the Avodah of guarding the Mikdash was done through the Tamid. So it's part and parcel of the Korban Tamid. One of the things that the Korban Tamid accomplished was the idea of Shmiras HaMikdash, that there wasn't the Hesach Hadas. And according to this, it seems to lead to an afkamin and halacha, that the guarding wasn't the whole night, but rather only until the start of the Tamid. Because once the Tamid is brought, then you already accomplish whatever the guarding accomplishes, which is that they shouldn't have any Hesach Hadas, and so there's no longer any need for the guarding. So now we can understand why the Shmir is only at night and how it's connected to Maseches Tamid. The reason it's only at night is because during the day, you already have it accomplished through the Avodah. And that's why it's in Maseches Tamid, because that's one of the things that the Tamid is accomplishing. It's accomplishing what the guarding accomplished. And therefore it's taught at the beginning of Maseches Tamid. According to this, we can explain another thing that we didn't mention before, and that is why in Maseches Tamid it only teaches the 3 places the Kehanim guarded, whereas in Maseches Midas it also teaches about the 21 places that the Leviim guarded. The explanation is because in Maseches Tamid, over there, it's not coming to teach the mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash, but rather it's coming to teach one of the aspects of the Tamid that's connected to and continues from the guarding of the Mikdash, and that is that they're not Masiach Das. We have that in the Tamid. And this connects to the guarding of the Kehanim on the inside. The Kehanim guarded on the inside, the Leviim guarded on the outside. And the Tamid, what it replaces, it also replaces the Leviim, but in a direct way, the guarding of the Kehanim was on the inside. The Tamid takes place on the inside, and so the connection of the Tamid that we're trying to bring out, that it has an aspect of Shmiras HaMikdash, which is that they're not Masiach Das, that relates to the guarding of the Kehanim. It doesn't connect to the guarding of the Leviim. Whereas in Maseches Midas over there, it teaches about the mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash as it relates to the importance of the Mikdash itself, because that's what Maseches Midas is about. It's about the structure and the building and the measurements of the Mikdash. And the guarding is connected to the very being of the Mikdash because the guarding elevates the Mikdash. It shows the greatness of the Mikdash. And it's talking about the Mikdash itself. And therefore it counts all the guards, since that adds to it being a palterin sheyeshel of Shemrin. Now, one thing over here also that's not clearly explained in the Sicha is what changed between the previous beer and this beer. That according to the previous beer, we said even one or a few guards are enough, and so it should just teach that the Kohanim guarded in 3 places and mention about the Levium in a different Masechta, not in Midas. Whereas according to this explanation, we're saying that it makes sense to teach both about the Kohanim guarding and the Levium guarding. So it seems that the answer is, because according to this explanation, that not to be Masiach Das shows about the greatness of the Mikdash, and it elevates and it makes the importance of the Beis Mikdash. So then, for whatever reason there is a need for additional guards, each one of those guards is adding to that greatness that it's giving to the Beis Mikdash. If it's to give kavod to the Mikdash, so if you mention, if we're taught that one person guarded or a few people guarded, you already added to the kavod of the Mikdash. More people doesn't relate to the very being of the Mikdash. It doesn't belong in Maseches Midas. Whereas over here that we're saying that it actually elevates. It's not kavod that's given to the Mikdash, but it actually elevates the greatness of the Mikdash itself. Then for whatever reason it would be needed to have additional guards, the bottom line is that as there are more guards, it adds more to elevating the very Mikdash itself. So it's not kavod that's given to the Mikdash, but rather it's not being Masiach Das, which elevates the very Mikdash itself and it connects to the Mikdash itself. So each person that's added as a guard adds to that. And so therefore it's relevant and related and connected to Maseches Midas that talks about the being and structure of the Mikdash itself. According to this, we could see how the first 3 questions at the beginning of the Sicha are already answered. Number 1, we understand why the Rambam doesn't bring the Psukim. We already explained that before, because those Psukim relate and explain that the Shemiras HaMikdash is in order Shaloi Kanazar, and that's not how the Rambam learns the mitzvah of Shemiras HaMikdash. According to this point, we learn that it's because that there shouldn't be Hesach Hadas. And we also see how questions 2 and 3 are answered, because we asked, why doesn't the mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash apply the whole day and the whole night? Why is it only at night? And also in the Psukim, there's no indication that the guarding is only at night. Because according to what we explained, that what the Shmira accomplishes is Shaloi Yasiach Das, so that's already accomplished automatically by the Avodah that's done throughout the day in the Mikdash. And at night, where we don't have it, that's what the guarding serves to replace or to accomplish. To guard that the Shalei Sichos Das, and that elevates the status of the Mikdash. And so therefore it's only required at night. And even though the Psukim don't indicate it, since that's the role that it plays, and it's only needed at night, so it's only done at night. In the daytime, it's already accomplished through the Korbanos. According to this, that the guarding as an aspect of kavod is that the Mikdash has guards that are not having Hesach Hadas from it, so we can understand what the Rambam writes, Loleches Svivay Tamid, which is our 4th question. What is the idea of walking, and how does it relate to the mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash? Now we can understand what the Rambam writes over there regarding the mitzvah of guarding the Mikdash. The Mishneh teaches that Ish harabayis hoye mechazer al kol mishmar u'mishmar, and v'chol mishmar she'ina emed nikr shu yashin chayvte b'makle chulu. There was somebody walking around, and he would inspect, and he would see that any mishmar, any one of these guards that wasn't standing, and then he would notice that the person sleeping, he would hit him with a stick. And so since the idea of guarding because of kavod is that the Mikdash has guards that are not having Hesach Hadas from it, so when the Ish Harabayis would go around from mishmar to make sure that they weren't sleeping, so meaning that they weren't having Hesach Hadas, that's a greater degree of not having Hesach Hadas. He's overseeing and inspecting and supervising that they don't have Hesach Hadas. And so that captures in it the whole idea of Shmiras HaMikdash, which is not to have Hesach Hadas. And that's what the Rambam is referring to when he talks about the Loleches Svivay Tamid. He's referring to this Ish Harabayis, where through him we see expressed and manifested this idea of Shmiras HaMikdash in a greater way, that he's overseeing and making sure that nobody's having Hesach Hadas. According to this, we can now answer a question on what's taught at the beginning of Maseches Tamid. It says over there the location where the Kehanim guarded. So it says Beis Aftina, so Beis Anitzitz, Hayu Aliyas, they were structures, they had roofs. V'haraven Shemrim Sham, the raven would guard there. And the Gemara, it says that they're called raven because they are not yet at the age of Aveda. And the Mefarshim explain that this means that they're less than 13 years old. And so the question that's asked is, how did they leave this mitzvah for Ktanim that are not able to do mitzvahs? They're not chayiv in mitzvahs. And according to the explanation of the Sicha, that the whole reason for the guarding is because of Hesach HaDas, then the question is even greater. How did they leave this mitzvah for Ktanim that don't have Das? However, according to what we just said, that the Ish Harabayis would go around and it served the purpose of not having Hesach HaDas, because that was his whole job. So then we can explain over here that it's like a case of a gadol that's oimid al gabe katan, where we find in many matters, or a number of matters, that need machshava, that it's good enough if there's the maisa katan combined with the machshava of a gadol that's standing on top of him. And so also over here we have the maisa of the katan with the machshava of the gadol, because the gadol is going around. And especially over here, you don't actually need the kavana, but rather the very fact that there are people around the Mikdash, that is the kavod of Mikdash, because it shows that you're not being Masiach Das from it. And so in that case, it's enough, even if if the gadol's not Emin al Gaba of the whole time, but rather he's just going around from one mishmer to the next.